Hey, welcome back to another episode of Parker's Pensées. This is a podcast where we explore all the deepest ideas in philosophy, theology, nature, and life. I love thinking about cool stuff, so come think with me. I'm really excited for this episode. I have with me Joe Folley. I just found out his last name is Folley, which is so weird because that sounds like foolish, but this dude's not foolish. He's a wisdom lover. I think I would call him a philosopher. I don't know if he'll call himself that. Everyone's weird about that title, whether it's an honorific or not. We'll get into that. I'll ask him. But Joe is the host of Unsolicited Advice on YouTube. It's a exploding YouTube channel, public philosophy. He takes big concepts and makes them available to you guys. It's huge. So I'll leave a link in the description for that. I highly recommend his channel. Before we jump in with the conversation with Joe, I want to talk about the sponsor for this video, which is Sages, Mages, and Wisdom Machines. This is my own personal philosophical science fiction and fantasy magazine. This is issue number 1, and you guys can get that right now if you pre-order in the link in the description. I am going to order some extras so that you guys can order them when the pre-order is done. But if you want to guarantee that you get one of issue number 1, a copy, make sure that you pre-order in the description. I've commodified myself a ton, so there's a bunch of ways to support me here on YouTube if you're watching, YouTube members, Patreon, Substack, there's a bunch of different ways. So if you like this podcast, you want to see me stick around, keep talking with people like Joe Folley, then consider becoming a patron or supporting in another different way. All right, that's enough commodification. Let's jump in with Joe Folley of Unsolicited Advice. Joe, thanks so much for coming on the podcast, man.
Not at all. Thank you so much for having me.
Yeah, this is fantastic. So, dude, you kind of jumped onto the scene and exploded in the YouTube philosophy world. That's how I would describe it, but maybe you would describe it differently. How has it been starting up this channel and growing exponentially, I would say?
Oh yeah, it's been a lot of fun. I actually started the channel largely because I was kind of tutoring at the time, and so I would run through particular texts with students, and they're a mixture of students doing kind of maths or philosophy or something like that, and we'd sometimes look at a particular text that they're interested in, and then afterwards I'd just make a video about it, and then I'd send it to them to be a kind of like, we looked at this today. Here's like a reminder of roughly the stuff we talked about, which is sometimes why some of my very early videos can come across as like really idiosyncratic. It's because they were all written with one person in mind. But yeah, that's just how I kind of got started, and then a couple of them took off, and I just thought, okay, like I'll keep making these if people are interested. I'm very big on just the idea of like philosophy education, and I tried to, I don't know, my like goal is to sort of, I don't know, be like a philosophy communicator, so to speak.
Yeah, totally. You're great at it. I forgot, or I continually forget that I started my public philosophy stuff for the same reason. I was helping co-teach a intro to philosophy class. I was a graduate assistant, and I got to teach for like half hour every class, which was great. So I'd do like the puzzles of philosophy, and it was really rewarding, really awesome. But I would do the same thing. I had all these notes, so I'm like, I might as well just make this into a video. And so that's how it started too. That's pretty cool. I love to hear that origin story. For those who know you but maybe don't know your background as much, can you tell us a little bit about how you got into philosophy, and then talk a little bit about your education?
Yeah, sure. So, I mean, I got into philosophy very, very young. I actually got into philosophy through Philosophy of Language. One of the first philosophy books, actually, I'll get it. It's on my shelf. One of the first philosophy books I ever bought was this, which is Gary Kemp's What Is This Thing Called Philosophy of Language?
Oh, nice.
And
Cool.
I sort of got into it because I was deeply struggling to understand the people around me. And I sort of, I kind of, I would, a teenager, or I was early teens, this is when I was like 13. And a lot of people around me would have arguments, and I just kind of didn't really know what they were talking about. It all seemed a bit vague. I found it very difficult to pin down definitions, and so I looked into specific language, and then that kind of led me to the philosophy of language. So I ended up going into philosophy through kind of a slightly weird route. But yeah, and then I kind of I got very interested. This is fantastic. I mean, I kind of read as much philosophy of language as I possibly could. I tried to read early Wittgenstein at like 14 and didn't understand any of it, but it was good to give it a go,
Yeah.
And and then I kind of got to applying for university, and I was originally gonna apply for drama school, but I just didn't in the end. And I thought, I want to do philosophy university, and then I sort of, on a kind of whim, the night before the application deadline, I like sent off an application to Cambridge. So I was like, in for a penny, in for a pound, and then through some absolute stroke of luck, I managed to get in, and then I did my undergrad there, and then I did a master's there, and then I started doing this.
That's awesome. Can you tell us, so I think master's over there, it's called a dissertation. Is that right? You do a master's dissertation?
Yeah, so I did kind of I wrote like 3 bits of essay work over the course of my master's. So I had a thesis, and then I had 2 kind of minor essays.
Gotcha. Okay. And what was that work primarily in?
Oh, my master's thesis was in epistemic logic. So it was in, there's a problem in epistemic logic called the omniscience problem, which is the idea that under the standard axioms of epistemic logic, you end up modeling an agent such that they know all of the logical consequences of their beliefs. And of course, we don't tend to know that. So I proposed a system, which I'm not actually that much of a fan of in hindsight. But at the time, it struck me as very good fun. And the idea, I kind of just defined a series of functions and connectives that allowed the logic to kind of tail off, and it ended up being much messier than I thought it would be. But it was a lot of fun. I really enjoyed doing it. I thought my master's was I mean, you get to spend a year just kind of reading philosophy and writing about the philosophy that you enjoy. Yeah. So it's a lot of fun.
That is fantastic. Have you done a video on unsolicited advice on your master's thesis yet?
I haven't. I probably won't. It's a little bit dry, and it's it's one of those things like when I don't know if you have the same thing. Like whenever I write something about like even less than a year later, I'll tend to look back on it and think, oh God, that was awful. I don't want to talk about that. I kind of have a real, and so I probably wouldn't. I'd probably die from kind of, well, not even secondhand embarrassment, firsthand embarrassment.
Yeah.
And so I probably it's also just kind of like technical. It's not that mathematically interesting because I was like testing out a theoretical approach more than designing a really, like, if I was going to go back and do it, I would probably try and include like type theory, and I probably neaten it up like that and kind of involve a bit more interesting maths. But at the time, I was just like testing out a new approach, and on the whole, I don't know. On the whole, I say I changed so much about it that I wouldn't want to write a video on it. But as I say, I did enjoy it.
Well, so I asked about that. I figured that would be your response because same thing with Jared Henderson. He's like, look, it's even hard to talk about what I studied because it's rigorous, logical stuff. I'm probably the opposite, where I'm like, I was so into the literature of my master's thesis that I wrote in systematic theology. I didn't write one for my philosophy MA, but for my systematic theology MA, I did. And I'm like, I was so into the literature that it would be even hard to talk about. Like, I lived in the footnotes, so it's like, how do I even discuss this in a way that does justice to the thinkers that I'm talking about? And so it's tough. It's really hard to talk about those kind of academic-y type things in a YouTube video.
Yeah, I mean, the other thing is that I one of the things that I try and want to get across in my YouTube videos is that, philosophy can be interesting and thrilling and it can be relevant, and I don't know that like a kind of 20 pages on solving one tiny technical problem in quite an obscure field, even within the world of logic,
that's right,
will be the best way to get that message across.
Yeah, that's so funny. So one of the things that's great about your channel is that you communicate in a really easy way, but I mean, I don't think you're dumbing things down. I think you are bringing people up to the top shelf cookies instead of bringing them down, which is great. One of the unfair advantages that you have is your accent. It's just it's not really fair. Like whatever you say is going to sound smart.
No, it's Alex O'Connor, I think, has said a similar thing. It's like, man, we've got an advantage, the kind of posh British accent. Yeah, I mean, I try not to dumb things down as much as possible. I do obviously end up simplifying things. I mean, a classic example of this is in almost every video I'll do on like a thinker whose interpretations are so heavily debated, someone like Nietzsche, is that inevitably it's because almost everything you say about him is contested.
Yeah.
I will end up having to strip away a lot of the contestedness, and just what I normally do is just stick it right at the front of the video and say, just to let you know, everyone disagrees about everything, but let's plow on. Here's one view on things. And you know, to say, because even, you know, I'm actually working on a video on there's this will be probably months. It takes me although I tend to upload quite frequently, each video takes quite a long time. It's just that all of the videos that I'm writing now I started work on in like May. And and yeah, and it's something that a video I'm working on at the moment is its working title is called The Search for the One True Nietzsche. And I'm just literally, without without even getting into the interpretive difficulties of like non-Anglo-American scholars, people like Deleuze or Heidegger or something, without even touching that, just sticking to like what is a sort of small part of overall Nietzsche scholarship, just the Anglo-American academic world, trying to illustrate just how much disagreement there is over every single aspect of Nietzsche. So like, you know, taking something like the will to power and being like, well, you know, there's a significant portion of Anglo-American scholarship that treats that as like basically a psychological phenomenon, and they're motivated by a lot of the skepticism that Nietzsche has about systems and metaphysics and ontology. But then there's a whole other group that do treat the will to power as a reasonably metaphysically heavyweight thesis. Yeah. And like, they're not being ridiculous in that. You know, that both of these camps have like really good arguments.
Yeah.
And then, you know, there's a third camp, which I think is also very interesting, which treats the will to power as a metaphysical thesis, but one that is encapsulated within a sort of fictionalism. Again, it's like you know, and I just got a kind of I've got a whole list of concepts. I'm going to go through them one by one and be like, here are 3 well-evidenced, irreconcilable interpretations of not just like a peripheral concept, like some of the key concepts in Nietzsche. And even then, I won't even be scratching the surface of the amount of disagreement out there. So I'm very excited about that kind of things. Yeah, it's definitely... sorry, go on. No.
I love that whole thing. I think the fact that you hedge in the beginning of your episode shows that you are an analytic at heart, because the Continentals would not hedge. Here's the absolute truth, and here we go. But I think something that I found interesting as well, and I think I picked this up from maybe the humanities folks and the history folks, who are they're related. Maybe history of ideas is kind of like history of philosophy in a different branch or on a different floor in the university. But a lot of these people will talk about reception history. And so on top of all the interpretations, what did he actually say? There's also, how has he been received? And I'm thinking like, I like comic books and stuff. I'm like, how has Nietzsche been received? The Ubermensch been received in Superman literature and Conan and stuff like that. And it's like, that's a whole different, maybe he didn't even mean that, but the Americans thought he did. So here's what they thought he said. So it's another
yeah, absolutely. I mean, and even, you know, if you wanted to go one step further, you can trace like interpretations of Nietzsche and then responses to like a classic one is, you know, like one of the most impactful interpretations of Nietzsche ever in Anglo-American scholarship is Walter Kaufmann's interpretation of Nietzsche. And that made a huge splash, but it's also incredibly controversial. So like, I don't know, reception, I mean, I like the idea of reception scholarship. I'd like to, I've got a video that probably won't come out for ages, but I'm kind of sketching the contours of at the moment, which is a video that I want to do about the reception to Camus' work from Sartre and vice versa, and kind of how their relationship just collapsed over the course of about 5 years.
Yeah.
And you know, from people who at the very least were not like at one another's throats. You know, these were respectful colleagues, I suppose, and how that devolved into Sartre really being not quite a fan of Camus. The difficulty I'm finding with that is that quite a lot of the account of that is written by Simone de Beauvoir, who of course is not an unbiased source here. You know, kind of Sartre's lifelong companion. Unsurprisingly, she thinks Camus being pretty unreasonable. And I think, yeah, that's fine, but like, I don't know, you seem a bit compromised here.
Yeah, totally. So one thing I wanted to ask is, I mean, you did your master's work in the most rigorous analytic stuff of analytic philosophy, and here you are talking about Camus and Sartre and and all these Continental folks. How the heck did you do that? How'd you get into more continentally stuff? Were you there all along, or did you have to retrain yourself into read and talking about their ideas?
So I think it's an ongoing process. I mean, I think it helps that like I've always been a little bit within analytic philosophy. I was always very keen to try out new approaches, even if it may be at points strained absolute rigor. But the other thing is just that it has been something that I've tried to work very hard on and always don't always succeed at. I mean, one of the things that I want to improve about the way that I approach Nietzsche and Kierkegaard and many others, even someone like Sartre or Camus, is that I recognize that a lot of my work on it is like painfully Anglo-American. It really is like you can tell, and that's not necessarily always a good thing. I mean, it's something I'm very open about, but I want to stretch my own philosophical horizons there and get into some of the less Anglo-American ways of even approaching those thinkers. I think that but one of the reasons I got into it is just because, well, one of the reasons why I started getting into Nietzsche was because of the kind of proto-naturalist interpretation of Nietzsche, which I found out about through Hugh Price, who's a kind of modern pragmatist philosopher, Australian guy, really lovely. Just like a really nice guy. I once heard him speak, and he was just like the loveliest man in the world. And something he makes in like an offhanded comment. His work is on subject, a field called subject naturalism, which is the idea of taking this sort of very successful naturalistic approach to philosophy, but not forgetting that the human is a naturalistic object, and that our psychology is not some kind of objective truth-seeking machine, and for philosophy to really take into account that insight. And Hugh Price sort of offhandedly references the fact that alongside classic thinkers that a lot of that you'll learn about in a British analytic style university, people like Hume and even people like the kind of the very idea of the synthetic a priori by Kant, even though that's obviously not treating the human as a naturalistic object, it's taking into account the measurer a little bit, even if it's still in a way that basically amounts to functional objectivity. But and alongside those names, he mentioned Nietzsche, and I was like, oh, that's really interesting. This is me at like 19 reading this and kind of thinking, oh, the only things I've ever heard about Nietzsche have been like, read a lot like poetry, and I not necessarily was. I'm actually really like literature now, but I wasn't so much when I was a teenager. I was very hard nosed, and I was just a bit of a philistine, I suppose. But like but yeah, and then this kind of I was like, oh, okay, no, this Nietzsche guy is probably worth looking into for this like pragmatist philosophy I was quite a fan of at the time. And I kind of went in through Brian Leiter's interpretation of Nietzsche, who really is kind of Nietzsche as proto-naturalist. I kind of assumed that was the interpreted Nietzsche that Hugh Price had in mind when he made these observations, because that's very Brian Leiter's. That's very much the kind of impression that Brian Leiter gives. It's been a while since I've read Brian Leiter, but certainly that was the impression I was left with. And and then I just kind of went from there. I started reading primary sources, and just found a lot to love. I found a lot to love in the concept of a kind of multiplicitous drive-based picture of the human. It chimed quite nicely with a lot of my, I don't know, at the time very like Anglo-American empiricist leanings, because a lot of people have an impression of Nietzsche as a very woolly philosopher. And I think that while Nietzsche is, multiply realizable by many plausible interpretations, he has times of being, he has points where he is a very, very hard-nosed. In something like Human All Too Human, you really do see Nietzsche at his most hard-nosed. And even when, moving into Daybreak, and then, thinking particularly about the genealogy of morals, these are points where you could read Nietzsche and think, wow, this is like a very angry, but nonetheless incredibly hard-nosed philosopher. And I think that I'm like 99% sure that's not how Nietzsche would want to be remembered.
Mhm.
But you do see like you see bits of that creeping through, and I think that's what initially drew me to him, and then I kind of came to appreciate some of the stuff that Nietzsche liked about himself a bit later.
That's awesome. I started out in theology, and I was always kind of a philosopher in disguise, but I was getting 2 free master's degrees, so I'm like, "Well, I'll do the theology thing for a little bit, that's cool." And, most of the theologians are, like, only talking with Continental philosophers, so I'm here, like, obsessed with analytic philosophy, like, "Yeah, yeah, that's fine, okay, anyways, no more of those guys, let's get back to the analytic stuff." And, so then I went on to do a master's in analytic philosophy of religion, and still found some Continental guys sneaking in, and like Heidegger in the philosophy of technology. And I'm like, no, no,
Mm.
you're not supposed to be here. What are you doing here? Go away. And then through the public philosophy that I do on YouTube, people just kept on saying like, can you talk about Nietzsche? I mean, you have his mustache. Can you at least like read some of his stuff? I'm like, I guess I could. But I really came to love some of the Continentals through a deep dive I took on like aphoristic philosophy. That aphorisms
Mm.
are a particular type of doing, a particular way of doing philosophy, probably peaked with like Georg Lichtenberg or maybe Pascal, or maybe you would say Nietzsche. But this was a style of philosophy that goes all the way back. Aristotle has a philosophy of maxims and how they're different than
Mm.
the aphorism. And so once I found this, I was like, this is actually what I want to be kind of a sage someday, maybe not now, but this is kind of what a lot of people think of when they think of philosophy, being a wise person who can do the analytic, rigorous arguments, but also who can say something wise and profound here and there. And so it was through my burgeoning love of aphorisms that I came to respect Nietzsche a little bit more, but definitely Camus. Where I'm like, I have
Mm.
his collected notebooks, and I'm like, I love this
Mm.
guy. I used to not like him at all, and now I'm like, I feel like I know him, and I love this guy. Like I feel for him, and
I
just seeing the
yeah.
inside of his mind is huge. Yeah,
Yeah, no, I can't really. It's funny enough. It's a real inner conflict to always have covering these more aphoristic style philosophers. Like I recently did a video on Emile Cioran,
yeah,
and I felt a similar conflict over him that I often feel over Nietzsche, where it's like, it's like quoting one of these aphorisms, even though it's something that they directly said, feels like a weird way to approach them because
yeah,
a lot of the time it only becomes, even getting any kind of like sensible interpretation of them is one of those things that it seems to emerge at a distance, like I it's very easy to string together a series of Nietzsche quotes and just like make him like put him in a box.
yeah,
And likewise with people like Turan or even Pascal, if you were to just take like 3 very carefully selected lines from the Pensées, you
mhm,
could probably make Pascal say a whole bunch of stuff, right? And
yeah,
and I think that one of the things that I always try and bear in mind is that at least by um, by most of these aphorists' own standards, including Nietzsche and Turan, I don't actually know whether this applies to Pascal, but I would wager that it does, no pun intended. And they tend to say things like, these aphorisms aren't meant to be like truths that I impart to you. These are meant to be things that you wrestle with and unpack and extract meaning from. And I find that it's very similar, I suppose, to engaging with a philosophical novel. Camus, I think, is a really good example. It's like The Plague. It's not like The Plague comes ready packaged with a message. If you were to just take like the stuff that Dr. Ryu says and be like, well, Dr. Ryu is the closest you have to a kind of Camusian absurd hero-esque figure in this, maybe Taru, but like Ryu's the point of view character. If we were just to take everything he says as if Camus was saying it, I don't think that would be the best way to approach it. The whole story has to be kind of wrestled with in a way that will leave people with very different ideas as to what's actually said. I think that with and I think that part of what I try and get across on the channel is that I think there's real room for that. I don't think that it's possible to misinterpret these thinkers, but there's a lot wider scope for interpretation than one might first think. And I think a lot of the time that's seen by the sheer amount of disagreement among both people that read them at the time
yeah.
and also now like academics debating what they said.
I think you're 100% right. The coolest one of the cool things about aphorisms, there's a great intro to Georg Lichtenberg's waste books, and he called them the waste books, but it's really just a his notebooks collecting all of his aphorisms. And Lichtenberg isn't really, I mean, he was kind of a natural philosopher, kind of a scientist, but he's best known as, well, one, the guy who critiqued Descartes' cogito, and he's like, look, how do I know that there's an I going on here? But also for being an aphoristic philosopher, and the intro to that kind of gives the qualifications or the qualities, the properties of a pure aphorism. And he's like, it's Hollingsdale. I forgot his first name, maybe R.J. Hollingsdale, but he says they're brief, they're witty, they're isolated, and they're philosophical. And so it's different than a maxim. It's different than a proverb. Proverbs don't really have an author. It's like proverbial wisdom passed down from generations, but aphorisms have author. We point to the author and say, look how witty this guy is. Look at how philosophical. Wow. But the isolated nature of them just resists systemization, because it's like a joke, and either you get it or you don't. But if you try to explain it, it's like explaining a joke. And for the analytics in us, we're like, well, no, I'm going to systematize it. I'm going to totally explain what this is going on. And some of the aphoristic philosophers like, stop doing that. Either you get it or you don't. If you have ears to hear, then hear it.
I think that, and the other thing is, I think a lot of aphoristic philosophers, again, they're not trying to impart like a complete message. It's not the point. The point is the part where you struggle to understand it.
Yeah.
That was very unfamiliar for me. Look, reading aphoristic philosophers from like Frege. Frege is dead. You're dead certain that he's, at the very least, he's trying to hammer in what he thinks into your brain with as little ambiguity as possible. And while there does end up being scope for interpretation, that scope is a lot narrower than you would find in a more aphoristic style philosopher. I mean, Turan is a good example of this. It got so far that and also because I don't speak French, unfortunately, and there's such little Turan scholarship in English. As in, there's some. I'm not saying there's none out there. There's actually some really good work out there, but it doesn't. There's not so much that you could appeal to any kind of tradition of Turan interpretation, and like I think that the line that gets passed around, kind of English-speaking Turan scholarship is Susan Sontag said that Turan didn't say anything that Nietzsche didn't say, and then people just disagree or agree with that. It's like there's whereas I gather that in French there's a much more fleshed out academic, but of course I can't read that, so Right. It may as well not exist for me. So I ended up in the video just basically saying, look, this isn't really a summary of Turan's philosophy. Here are 4 themes that I really like, and we're just going to go through that, because I don't know how to give you Turan. Like it's almost impossible.
Yeah, I'm the same way. So with the Pensées, Pascal's Pensées, hard to systematize it. You could I've seen people try to do it, but it was not a complete work. He passed away before its completion, and it was published posthumously. And he was trying to make like a work of apologetics, but you read it and you're like, this has to do with one. How come this soldier gets to kill me? Oh, it's because the two kings are mad at each other. What's that about? And you're like, well, this is not really apology for Christianity. These are just fantastic aphorisms that are actually isolated. So I love to see like you talking about Sion, because I had been researching him because of my aphoristic stuff, and because I have this ParkNotes thing where I talk about how to write like Gandalf. But to see you do it, I'm like, dude, this doesn't make sense. You shouldn't be doing this, Mr. Analytic. It's so cool. It's really great to be in this project and to see that other people are also exploring the same kind of things in such depth. So that's been awesome.
Oh, thanks. Turan is a very interesting thinker. I think that I think people are always surprised at how funny Turan is. Turan is one of the only philosophers where I really do laugh out loud reading him, despite the fact that he's saying really quite pessimistic things about, rotting flesh and maggots and how everything's awful and there's no satisfaction. But he does it in such a funny way. Yeah. It's really kind of, and in the translations that I happen to have, it really does come across, which I'm very grateful for, because I think that's such an integral part of his philosophy.
Yeah, that's fantastic. I've been really enjoying my read of him. Another person who's kind of made me step out of the analytic side of things. So you mentioned Frege, and one of the virtues of analytic philosophy is just be clear. It's like if there's any virtue, it's that. Be very, very clear so that someone can see exactly what you're arguing and argue against you or affirm it, whatever the case. And I obsessed over that to the point where, I'm working on propositional logic and quantificational logic and all sorts of stuff. And I would take a break to go and read some science fiction. And I read Frank Herbert's Dune Messiah. And there's a little aphorism in there that says, truth suffers from too much analysis. And it changed my whole life. I'm like, oh, you know what? I am kind of translating things into this rigorous language, and so many people can't even understand it. And if I'm having a bad day, I can't understand it. So sometimes the aphorism is the best way to communicate truth. And I love my analytic friends and my professors, but some of them are missing out if that's all the philosophy that they are imbibing or something.
Mm. I mean, something that I think that analytic philosophy doesn't do as well is that, especially approaching something like an existential issue, is that these are only partly cognitive issues. They're also issues of affect. They're issues of emotion and drive and instinct. And, first order predicate calculus is just not necessarily the most efficient way of getting to that. And I think, sometimes things like poetry and fiction and philosophy that is written closer to that style can be very, very helpful. I've become more appreciative of philosophy that is written in such a way that makes you slow down, because you get presented again with a page of Nietzsche, and sometimes it is just like totally unclear what he means, and you read it again and again, and it's still unclear what he means. But that process of wrestling with it is actually very valuable. Sometimes it leads you to thoughts that are entirely disconnected from Nietzsche, but are very handy. And I think that that's something that I've come to appreciate a little bit more.
Yeah.
And it's not necessarily something that you end up with in analytic philosophy might be hard to understand, but it's normally hard to understand just it's very technical, as opposed to because that process of wrestling can be such a huge part of the point of reading it.
Yes. And like some of the best won't be as, maybe they'll translate it back into common language. And it's just so clear that it's like, okay, all right, I get it. But yeah, it doesn't have as much of a profound impact. The one thing I will say is, having been trained in an analytic master's program, it does help me when I want to convey these things. I try not to just say, here's exactly what whoever a Continental philosopher said, but I could say, like, here are three interpretations which I think could be taken of this person. You could say this, or this. Let's just stipulate that it's this one. If it's this one, here's what may follow from what he's saying. And that's been really helpful. So it's like the tools of analytic philosophy are super helpful for, I think, getting at the better questions maybe in Continental philosophy. Or I know that's kind of a cliche, but it seems like the Continentals may have better questions, whereas the analytics may have better tools. But
well, occasionally I do think that analytic philosophy can have a tendency, and I say this with love, to sort of end up defining a question out of the reason why you cared about the question in the first place. I agree that finding a very having a precise taking a fine-tooth comb to a question like what's the meaning of life can help you realize that actually maybe what's the meaning of life isn't necessarily the most productive way or the most fruitful way to frame that question. But also there is a tempting response, and a response that I certainly had when I was a teenager, which is to say, I can't formulate this question rigorously, so it's not a real question, and I'm just gonna say that it's nothing. It's just a will-o'-the-wisp, and I think that's, in hindsight, just not necessarily a great way to approach things. Just because you do your best to define something out of existence doesn't mean that people stop caring about it. It doesn't mean that you'll stop caring about it either.
That's actually a really good point. Yeah. It doesn't mean you can escape it either, which is really fascinating. Well, so I want to talk about some of your favorite philosophers. This is a really hard question. I know I saw you and Alex O'Connor did a really cool like breakdown of kind of ranking tiers list type thing, which is fun. But maybe we can go like favorite or favorites on the Continental side, and then favorites on the Analytic side? Probably historical too.
So I
You
suppose,
probably throw in some historical guys.
I suppose, like from the ancient schools, it's got to be Aristotle. I mean, I know it's just like, when I say that Aristotle's one of, if not the greatest philosopher of all time, I do feel a little bit like how I feel when I say like my favorite book is The Brothers Karamazov. It's just like, yeah, man, like that's such a basic bitch opinion. It's like, yeah, I know, but like sometimes things are popular for a reason, and Aristotle is one of them. Like the Nicomachean Ethics, I think, is still, if I could recommend one philosophy book to the entire world, it would be the Nicomachean Ethics, because it's so relevant and so insightful and so like psychologically precise, and it's written over 2,000 years ago. That is just an astonishing achievement. And there is an argument to say that, I mean, I think it's like was it in medieval Europe, just if somebody said the philosopher, they meant Aristotle, which is just so
I think
cool.
Thomas Aquinas just calls him that. He's just like the philosopher. Who said
I mean, Thomas Aquinas is another giant as well. Like I always recommend Thomas Aquinas, and like a good introduction to Thomas Aquinas for atheists or agnostics looking to see what kind of quote unquote classical theism is all about. Totally. Because it kind of can get a bit lost in the kind of the sort of hyped up atheist versus theist debates, which I'm not a great fan of anyway. But like but very rarely do we end up with a nice discussion of Aquinas's first way that actually is like, let's dig into the weeds of that. Let's see what propositions are propping up what. Then in terms of like continental philosophers, I really like Nietzsche, but I quite like Nietzsche for very personal reasons. I find that a lot of Nietzsche speaks to me because for a lot of his life, he suffered from chronic pain. I suffer from chronic pain. So just that he just ends up being quite relevant to me, because in that sense, we have like a shared link that I find quite nice when reading him. In the beginning of Ecce Homo, he talks like quite a lot of length about just how much both his deteriorating sight, which I thankfully don't have, and his chronic pain condition have like really profoundly influenced his philosophy. And I think that that's often something that goes under-remarked upon in popular discussions of Nietzsche. But that's one reason why I really like him. I also just really like Kierkegaard. Like, if I could, like, Nietzsche's a very interesting philosopher to read. Kierkegaard, despite the fact that he comes across as quite grumpy sometimes, is the one who I think I'd actually want to spend time with. And moving across the continent a bit, I'm a big fan of Dostoevsky, but also a big fan of some of the authors around Dostoevsky, people like Gogol and Turgenev, and actually Lermontov, I never quite know how to pronounce it, but he's got some very interesting thoughts, and all these thoughts are communicated through novels, but they're I really enjoy them. And so I think from the Continental camp, I mean, I suppose if he counts as a continental philosopher, I do like Camus. I find that his relentless commitment to humanism is it straddles. Sometimes it comes across as like weirdly common sense, but at the same time, it's I don't know. There's something really in it. Like I like that. I really enjoy in The Rebel when he's writing. Half of the time, he's just seems to be trying to get across the idea that he wants to make sure that murder and killing remain exceptional and don't become routine or offhand things to do or consider. And I'm like, yeah, that's, sounds really obvious, but it's so easy to just offhandedly justify killing people in a philosophical context, I suppose, and in a kind of political context, right? These and actually just to be kind of have it hammered into you for like 350 pages of like, no, like, this is a human life. That's a thing that is enormously important. That always strikes me as quite as something that I always really admire about him. Those would be some from that camp. I would like to say Heidegger, but I really don't understand Heidegger well enough to say Heidegger. Like I kind of enjoy reading Heidegger. Sometimes I really enjoy reading Heidegger on technology, but I'm not sure I knew what he meant. It's one of those thinkers where like I need to I need to sit with him for a long time. It's like I quite often get requests about making a video on Heidegger, and I'm like, look, I will when I feel like I have a clue what he's talking about. But like I don't just want to parrot what I think is a respected scholar's interpretation of Heidegger. I want to plow through it before having the audacity to make a video on it. And then from the analytic camp, obviously Wittgenstein is just amazing, but also people like Frank Ramsey. Frank Ramsey died tragically young, but in his time alive, just revolutionized game theory and probability theory and philosophy, and had a real even laid the groundwork for some really good 20th century pragmatist thought. And so I always think he's a really underrated philosopher, just he died young. I also remember reading a story about him, which I think is insane considering just how prolific he was and just how brilliant his output was, where apparently he only worked for 4 hours a day and would then he'd just work in the morning from 8 till 12. And then he'd go out and he'd see friends and get coffee, and then it's just well,
I know, dude. That sounds amazing.
Annoyingly clever. Yeah, I know. It sounds great. It takes me forever to understand things. And here's Frank Ramsey just absolutely rattling off revolutionary philosophy of belief in the morning, and then going to.
He didn't have to edit the YouTube video of that, so.
No. And then from the analytic school, someone like Carnap, I think, is quite underrated. Very, very technical, very dry, but I think a really nice thinker who aimed to specify a lot of language. Even if ultimately his project failed, I think it was a worthwhile thing to attempt. And also, I think for a lot of these early 20th century analytic philosophers who are very, very focused on trying to do logical reductions, I'm not convinced that it's the best approach in all cases, but I do think that there's something really valuable in that intuition, and I would want to, take something like logical positivism. There are some bona fide defenders of logical positivism today, but on the whole, it seemed to have been it's the school that's fallen out of favor. But I don't think that we should throw the baby out of the bathwater with some of these hardcore ambitious analytic schools. There's something in trying to specify language as much as possible and to create these, or attempt to create these wonderful theoretical hyper-specified languages. And then moving into some later analytic philosophy, I really like Q Price. Hasok Chang is an analytic philosopher who writes a lot today, who's very, very good. I know it's hard to choose from, but there's me some, but that would be just a few.
I think Frank Ramsey is one that Timothy Williamson was saying is one of the tops, where he's totally underrated, short life, but amazing. So he kind of put me onto him as well.
I'm really surprised that Timothy Williamson thinks that, just because I imagine they would disagree on almost everything. But
Timothy.
Correct me if I'm wrong. It's been a while since I read Timothy Williamson. Is he still really hardcore metaphysician about things?
It's hard to say. For me, I know right now I believe his big project right now is still the knowledge first stuff.
Okay.
So that's what I think. Just from as an outsider, I haven't talked with. I talked with him 2 years ago, and some vagueness stuff, some philosophy of philosophy. I actually really love his stuff on the philosophy of philosophy, kind of defending the armchair method of philosophy, saying, hey, look, if the mathematicians get to sit in the armchair and your scientists, if you guys need them, then at least it's a legitimate form. Whether or not philosophers can use it or not, that's a different question, but you don't get to rule out the armchair altogether. And I'm like, man, I really love that.
Maybe I'm getting Timothy Williamson confused by someone. I sometimes get names confused. But he
does. What does he do? Something as metaphysics. What does he do? Modalities. Shoot. He definitely talks about everything. That's kind of why he's such a legend.
He is a kind of philosopher of all camps. I think he's even written some commentary on Continental philosophers. But there's providing we're thinking of the same person, because I say I'm terrible with
that
names.
Could be, yeah.
But
So I'm with you. The Carnap stuff's so funny. I think I used to just hate the logical positivists, and I would I was just such a Plantinga fan, where I'm like, yeah, take that. But now, like you said, even if the project failed, it's so worthwhile. And I feel the same way where I'm like, I'm so glad that they tried that so hard. And sometimes
Mm.
we laugh at them and like, look, they're trying, they reformulated their principle and they still fails. And it's like, but imagine if they just didn't. Like it's really good that
Mm.
they stuck with it and they tried to do that. I disagree with like them, but whatever. We can argue about it, which is great. I'm so glad that
Mm.
they did that work. I wonder if there's anyone, a philosophical school, philosopher, or idea that you just love to disagree with. Not necessarily that you hate them, but you're like, I don't get what's up, but I just love disagreeing with them.
Yeah, oh god, that's a really good question. For a while, it was like people who believed in lots of in large amounts of a priori knowledge. I was just like, no, I'm gonna like I still do have some of those empiricist intuitions in me. Who'd I really love to disagree with? Oh,
So as you think, I'll say for me it's Camus, where I said like I love this guy, and it's mostly I've read The Stranger a few times. I had to in grad school a bunch, and I didn't like him back then. But reading his aphorisms, reading his notebooks, I'm like, man, I
Mm.
disagree with you on like the fundamental stuff. But if I agreed with you worldview at the worldview level, I think I would just. You're right. Yeah, I think it would be absurd. I think all these kind of things. But I love to disagree with him. I love to disagree with Diogenes, because I'm just like if I believe what you believe, I think I would. Maybe I wouldn't do the same thing because a lot of people believe what he believes and they don't do what he did. But it's like
Mm.
that does seem consistent. I just think you're wrong because you have the wrong starting points. But I love it. I love that you're like this Socrates gone mad. I love to disagree with it with him in my head at least.
For a while, for me, the fun person to disagree with was like, yeah, hardcore metaphysicians, and then I got really into American
Mm,
pragmatism and like the kind of more actually the kind of more the more analytic British offshoot of American pragmatism, and then I kind of end up going, oh, I don't know, man, but like from that perspective, if somebody's like a hardcore Platonist, like what's it to me? You know, like, not in the sense that we can all believe our own
right.
things, but in the sense that all of the justifications for this latent pragmatism I'd held at the moment that I'm a bit less sure about now, were to do with same boat principle stuff. We're all dealing with the same kind of phenomenal reality. Our concepts have to be built up from naturalistic principles, la di da di da. But if somebody wants to posit a kind of causally disconnected Platonic realm, then like go for it, man. Like it's outside any of the discourse norms that I've justified. And so then I ended up not being able to disagree with them for a while. It reminds me a little bit of like Graham Oppy. His definition of naturalism generally deliberately limits itself to like the kind of world of linear causality. It's all framed in terms of causal chains, and I think that's brilliant because I think that quite a lot of naturalist arguments and kind of naturalist worldviews kind of implicitly do that, but then don't state it. And I think that Graham Oppy stating it is really good stuff. Like I find it a lot online. The very idea of like a hierarchical causal chain or a per se causal chain is just like dismissed out of hand without demonstrating that. And Graham Oppy, Graham Oppy has an argument for his kind of methodological naturalism that justifies him excluding that, or attempts to justify him excluding that. You may disagree whether it does, but nonetheless, like just stating that I think is important because so much of the time I find that the per se or hierarchical causal chains just thrown out like just because like it seems a bit weird when actually that does require a philosophical argument. It's kind of part of my kind of growing intuition that that I think that a lot of philosophical disagreements between atheists strokes agnostics and theists aren't to do with God at all. I think loads of them take place at this like prior conception of what counts for like a whole series of key concepts. Like, what counts as an explanation is one of the obvious ones. Like that's like a key battle. And so much, and like, another one is the admittance of causal chains. What can we have knowledge about? These are all and then, downstream of that, if you end up with, your kind of standard naturalist set of prior philosophical assumptions, which I still broadly hold, then you naturally end up in a kind of agnosticism. But if you reject those, then you quite often naturally end up not in a kind of agnosticism. And but nonetheless, despite the fact that I think most of the disagreement is happening up there at much more fundamental levels, the public arguments that you hear are all about God's existence, which I just don't think is where the disagreement is occurring at all. If I was a firm believer in hierarchical causation, I would have no choice but to affirm the existence of a prime mover. That of some kind. I've got quite into the idea of non-materialist non-theism recently, like just kind of playing around with that conceptual space, because it used to be a much bigger conceptual space, and it's kind of really narrowed down into basically no one exploring that territory in the past 100 years or so. And I think that's very interesting conception. What would happen if say you, as I think is a reasonably plausible position, you accepted Aquinas's first three ways, but rejected the inferences that he made about that prime thing, mover, grounder, whatever you want to call it, being a personal agent. But that strikes me as a very plausible position to hold, and also a completely fascinating one.
I mean, you probably have to ask him, but would you put Thomas Nagel in there?
Oh, yes, yeah, no, I think I would. I mean, Thomas Nagel, is he an outright non-materialist, or is he just not sure about materialism? I think he's a non-materialist. I liked his. Is it Mind in Cosmos?
Yeah.
Is that his?
Yeah.
Yeah, I know it got a lot of flack. I thought it was conceptually very interesting. A lot of the flack that it got, I think, was to do with its presentation of certain scientific concepts, and I can't speak to that. Yeah. I thought that I thought it was very interesting for just somebody to approach the project of, I'm going to see what non-materialism can do if we just totally disconnect it from theism. What do we do if he's basically, because in the first chapter, he doesn't give a justification for not being a theist. He just kind of says, God really doesn't appeal to me, man. But let's move on.
One of my favorite book reviews of that book, it's called Slumping Towards Theism. And I just have this picture of him I don't really want to, but that was by one of my professors. And I think a lot of us are that's pretty refreshing. It's just kind of refreshing. Hey, I don't like this. So that's not a live option for me, but what everyone else is saying in the reductive naturalistic camp, I think is wrong. So I'm going to argue against them. And you're well, then where are we? Where did you leave us? And he's deal with it. I don't know. Just deal with the arguments. You're that's.
We ends up with this kind of idea of natural teleology, doesn't it? Right. It's a kind of. I'd love to. I don't know. He probably has fleshed it out much more since Mind in Cosmos was published, but I would love to see more fleshed out versions of that. I think it's a lot of fun.
Of anything. I know he kind of appeals to panpsychism, and a lot of people have done some work with that, and it's been well, we don't need a god, or here's a cosmopsychist view where the whole universe, we're going from the cosmos being conscious down, and then maybe we can have some teleology, but I don't know if that's viable either.
Yeah, I think it's a very fun conceptual space, and also I like exploring these sorts of possibility spaces that are often discounted, but I think are discounted more for reasons of kind of just cultural inertia than philosophical reasons. I like the idea of from building on my previous point about how I think that theism is often downstream of certain methodological, metaphysical, and epistemological assumptions. What if you just had the epistemological one? And you just didn't have the metaphysical one, you didn't have the methodological one, and you just saw what happened. What do you end up with if you don't end up with all these? But partly because it's so tempting to divide the world of metaphysics and of theology and of philosophy more generally into the camp of materialist atheist and hardcore scholastic style heavyweight metaphysical Christian. It's like, no, there are like, even within the Christian camp, there are loads of variations on that.
That's where I live. So many Christian apologists, and it's kind of easy to dunk on Christian apologists or whatever. So I won't do it too hard, but a lot of them are like, it's exactly that. And they're like either here or here. And I'm like, well, are you a classical theist, neoclassical theist? Like where are you at personally? Well, it's either this or it's that. Or it's they'll just kind of throw out blanket statements and say the law of non-contradiction is universally holds and no one ever denies it. And like, well, here's this guy Graham Priest. Can I introduce you to him? I'm not saying he's right, but
he won't stop denying it. He's denied it for so many years.
That's right. So I'm with you on that, and actually that's really fun. I do really like when someone pulls up short of the full Christian or even just theistic picture and says, look, I like your arguments. I'm going with you. I like teleology, but I'm stopping here. And you're like, wait, you're not allowed to do that. But then they have really good reasons. And that just kind of advances the conversation. And you say, look, there's so much things we can't take for granted anymore because people are saying, look, I disagree with the reductionist picture, but I'm not a theist. So let's have that conversation. I love that.
Yeah, I mean, I think that, one of my potential like projects for the future of naturalism, I suppose, and I am just kind of parroting Hugh Price here. This isn't really my idea, but is that if we're going to be naturalists, we're going to have to be consistent, and we're going to have to treat the human being as a naturalistic object. So and that's going to involve potentially revisiting some of our kind of common sense. I like common sense epistemology and philosophy of language. Like a really classic example of that's like the correspondence theory of truth, right? So, standard, quote unquote, meaning that loads of people disagree with it, but like if you were to pick like a plurality of analytic philosophers probably hold to something like the correspondence theory of truth, which is to say, your sentences map onto the world in certain relations. So, I say, my laptop is on the desk, and that picks out the state of affairs in the world of my laptop being on the desk, and that's what makes it true. There's a correspondence between my language and the world. And it's fair for a naturalist to ask, like, what the hell is this correspondence relation? That is woo-woo metaphysics right there, and in your supposedly naturalistic picture of the world. We need to reformulate all of this if we're going to be consistent naturalists. And that's a deeply non-trivial task. That's like an absurdly non-trivial task. That is a task, at least on the level of ambition, as like a kind of Carnap style, I'm going to try and reform everything in observations type way. This is and I think it's genuinely an open question whether it can be done. And if it can't be done, then at the very least, we are implicitly committed to something that strikes me as deeply non-naturalistic. And that doesn't mean that, you could say, yeah, okay, there's this weird truth relation between propositions and like, I'm not going any further than that. And that's fine. But like, there's something quite philosophically unsatisfying about the idea of having this like very seemingly metaphysical branch off of your deeply unmetaphysical tree. And just, I think something like that, this is it's a very interesting question to explore. And I think that it, hopefully, if this kind of pragmatist subject naturalist project gets a lot of traction in the academic world, this will be something that people are working on. So I think it's a really fascinating question.
I'm always blown away with how honest you are, because I think Alex O'Connor is pretty honest about this stuff too, and he's had so many debates and stuff, so maybe that's helped. But I'm totally with you, and I've had that exact. I just published a Substack piece about definitions, basically, but about how it may be a cost for naturalism if we can pick out real definitions based on naturalistic evolution. Like, why would we? It's basically an evolutionary argument against naturalism, but applied to our own language and our own definitions. And so for me, I'm like, that might be a cost. It doesn't mean that if the project can go forward and you can give a naturalistic account, that's really fascinating as well. Or if you have to redo everything, it's really fascinating. If you can't, it doesn't mean that ultimately, supernaturalism wins. It's like, well, maybe the world is weird, like you said. Like maybe there are just some weird metaphysical things going on. But I love I love the inclination to say it's weird that it's weird. Let me try and figure that out. I don't want, because some people will just go, yeah, it's weird. Yeah, there's teleological laws, but there's no supernaturalism. Deal with it. And you're like, well, but isn't it kind of weird on your view of the world? Shouldn't you be able to say a little bit more? I understand the world's weird, but maybe we could go further. So I love that. I love the way you think, man. That's really cool.
Oh, thank you. I mean, I think that I think that there's, I think that it is an open question whether this subject naturalist project can be done while eschewing yourself of all of these correspondence style relations. I think that partly, and still end up with something that doesn't look like to most people some kind of thoroughgoing skepticism. Because that's the other danger, right? You redefine your language without correspondence, then you end up in a situation where you're saying our statements don't have anything to do with the world, and you think, oh great, man, like we're all just stuff then. Like, we're totally self-undermined.
Exactly. You got to watch out for the self-defeat going on. But yeah, dude, I think a lot of the older projects against folk psychology type stuff, I'm like, I know it's really almost cliche now to call them, performatively inconsistent or self-defeating, but I'm like, it kind of is. It kind of is. They say that for a reason, but what you're getting at is so it's in the similar vein, but it's like, let's redo it. Let's keep going. I think that is worthwhile and fascinating. It's like, let's see if you can do that. That's good.
Nice. And it's also, I always caution people against thinking that this is something that obviously can be done, because I think I don't know if it was, it might have been Carnap or it might have been somebody else at the beginning of the 20th, around, 20s, 30s, commenting on this ongoing logical positivist project of and basically just insinuating that it would just obviously, we will find a way of reforming our entire language in terms of observation statements. We never talk in that language, but in principle, it can definitely be done. And it's like, well, no, turned out every time someone tried, it couldn't be. So I'm very wary of this, because I have that intuition of of course we'll be able to reformulate our language without appealing to any kind of correspondence theory or identity theory or truth maker semantics or anything, without falling into this kind of thoroughgoing skepticism or detaching ourselves from the world of I don't know, convergent phenomena too much. But it is an open question. Like it has to be done in order to demonstrate that it can be done.
I think it's also kind of tough to go with the correspondence theory and flesh it out in detail. It doesn't leave you in some problems. I think that so often people are like, oh, truth is just a correspondence to reality. And when you say that, are you talking about truth maker theory? Are you talking about facts? Are you talking about propositions? How do propositions and facts line up? And are they both? Is a proposition a immaterial object? Where does that exist? And then is a fact? You say it's an obtaining state of affairs. States of affairs aren't physical things. What is that thing? And so it's like there's so many things to go into it.
And even to the level of how fine-grained are you cutting your propositions? Is it merely truth functional? That seems weird. That means that all contradictions are the same statement. That's really odd. And moreover, that every tautology within a given axiomatic system is saying the same thing, and that's also really odd. So it seems like a finer grained truth maker kind of semantics if we're going in that direction. But then how fine-grained you want it, Yes,
so
it is.
Because then that means that proposition, if it's a bearer of truth, it just was around forever. My pen is on the table. It's like, when did that come into being? What are you talking about? Now it's true. And then you have the, they are they're tensed, right? So it's like it's true now. Is it true now? It's not true now. What? That's the whole thing. It's fun.
And it's very, very easy, I think, for somebody to take a look at someone like that, giving a non-physicalist interpretation of propositions and be like, look how ridiculous a non-physicalist interpretation of propositions are. And it's like, yeah, okay, but try giving the physicalist one and see what difficulties you end up with, right?
This gets at one of
propositions are deeply odd.
This is and we need them to communicate. I think, right? So
Yeah, like they're totally indispensable. Just like you cannot do without them. Like try navigating the world without having some kind of consistency between the sentence the snow is white and was it il neige est blanc or whatever it is in French. And that's hard. That's a difficult thing to do.
I think you're right. This brings me to one of my favorite things about philosophy, and I think some people today a lot of professors of philosophy are enamored of public-facing philosophy, and I think I understand why. I think a lot of them are like, look, a lot of our colleagues are their programs are getting shut down, and we need to have some kind of valuable thing to bring to the world so that we keep our jobs. I get that. I don't have that problem, but I understand. My favorite thing about philosophy is just finding the bullets to bite with my friends' systems and my own systems, and kind of ribbing each other like, dude, you believe that, but you're gonna have to also believe this. Are you cool biting that bullet? And then just being like, that's a bullet. And then, like you said, we have these different intuitions. Even the intuition to describe fundamental things. Some people have this intuition that they're up here. Fundamental is up. Other people say fundamental is down at the root. That's even talking about it. But it's just really fun when you cannot take yourself so seriously and just kind of tease each other about, do you really think that? Is that really where your intuitions like bottom out? That's fascinating to me. I love the bullet biting nature of philosophy.
And the other thing is, I mean, the concept of intuition is deeply strange. Like, I mean, it was that classic definition of intuition is just like an intellectual seeming. It's like, yeah, man, that's so much clearer.
Thanks. That seems right.
I mean, it's one of the reasons why I'm quite bullish on certainly aspects of experimental philosophy. Is because I think that actually
we're so different, man. I love that, but I'm writing a novel against experimental philosophy right now, so this is great. I'm so glad to hear you say this.
I just feel like certainly for the kind of stuff that I'm quite interested in, things like a lot of the philosophy that I read in my spare time and sometimes bleeds into the channel is the link between philosophy of language and pragmatics, which of course, an experimental philosophy is invaluable there, because if you're going to say something like, okay, I did a video on pseudo profound bullshit, and like, okay, but like in order for something to be pseudo profound, it needs to be imitating profundity falsely. But like, what the hell do we mean by profundity? Like, I can give you an intuition, but actually there being a paper out there in the last 2 years that was like, we've surveyed a few hundred people qualitatively, they've described their definitions of profundity with examples, we've done a thematic analysis to bring these 5 key themes out. It's like, that's very important for if what I'm trying to look at is the kind of linguistic stroke pragmatic consequences of certain statements. I think there really is a place for experimental philosophy. I don't think it's like, I think there are questions that are obviously not suited to experimental philosophy. I think that like, you're not going to be able to poll the general public and or even professional philosophers and find an argument for truthmaker semantics or how fine-grained you want your truthmaker to be. But at the same time, I give like a really good example, I think, is that sometimes there are bits of like philosophical received wisdom about what people think or what most people think that do turn out to be false. So a really good example of this is that it was like for a long time, and probably still in areas of like popular philosophy, it becomes very commonplace to say something like, well, in everyday life, almost everyone is a moral realist. And then, a few people, I think it was like 10 years ago, like a few people just kept hearing this and were just like, no, okay, let's test this. And then, asked people and, with reference to particular examples and particular moral problems, and actually they found out that most people's meta-ethics is all over the place. There are propositions about which they are extreme moral realists, and there are propositions about which they are relativist, and there are propositions about which they are bordering on subjectivist. Like, genuinely, they say whether it's right or wrong is up to you. And that's, that flies in the face of that kind of offhand adage that have been tossed around in philosophy papers for nigh on 60 years of like, most people are moral realists.
It does seem like such a a work that needs to be done by a philosopher to challenge those things. What do you mean most? What do you mean people? Yeah, it's like that. That totally makes sense. I've inherited the sociology philosophy beef, so I'm like, when sociologists step over their skis a little bit or get out over their skis a little bit too much, and you're like, okay, settle down, guys. So I do tend to be more of the armchair guy defending that folk. But you're totally right. There is a place for it. There's also a place for the philosopher to come through and go be like, well, these definitions you used in the survey, I mean, they're misleading, and that's why people are saying this or that. And so I'm like, it's all good. It's the feedback is helpful for sure.
The other thing is, if anyone is a sort of is into statistics or into or just into like reading how surveys are done and analyzed, it is worth looking into just how a lot of studies are conducted, because there are often real methodological critiques. I tell you, a good example of this actually is and it's still a very good study. I'm not like opposed to this study at all, but there was one study done by, I can't remember their name, but it was a while ago. It's not a recent study. It was at least 10 years ago, I think, and they were studying people's receptivity to pseudo-profound bullshit. Was like part of, and as a result, they used randomly generated sentences of pseudo-profound bullshit. But like reading through them, you kind of went, okay, yeah, but if someone was taking a charitable view of like this sentence and this sentence and this sentence, they definitely could extract some kind of profundity out of that. It's not totally absurd to think that, okay, just because it's randomly generated, there couldn't be a sensible and reasonable profound interpretation, especially if you're then presenting these to people as profound. And actually, I was reading through this, and turns out there actually was a paper released that was a methodological critique of this. And I was like, one of the reasons why I bring this up, partly because actually, by far the majority of the study was very, very, was like totally, unquestionable. This is like this kind of tiny quibble almost. But what part of the reason why I bring this up is because so much of our like popular epistemological discourse, if that makes sense, is structured around the kind of second or third hand reporting of studies that have been conducted by someone else, which is kind of, to a certain extent, that's what we can hope for out of public discourse, right? We can't all go out, like, we don't have the resources to go out and conduct N equals 3,000 studies. It would be great if we did.
And then meta-studies of studies and
Exactly right. So we are relying on other, but occasionally it is worth digging down into in the field of psychology, whether these studies have been replicated, because a lot of them haven't been. And that's like, that raises questions about the original conclusion's generalizability. And secondly, just looking into the methodology, because, a lot of the time the methodology is absolutely fine. But like, you might disagree with it, and you are allowed to have problems with the study's methodology. Half the time, the people conducting the study themselves will talk about the flaws in their own methodology. It's not like nobody's being dishonest here. It's just that by the time it's passed through 4 or 5 layers of reporting, the bit at the bottom of the study, or the bit at the end of the study where they said, well, the limitations of our methodology is this, and here are the questions we'd like to, and it's important not to infer too much from this and get completely stripped away, and you're just left with the headline that's like, that's like, I don't know. Was it that was a headline?
The reporters do it. I mean, that's like basically their job now. It's just I will read half of a headline and then I'll make my own that's inflammatory. And it's like, man, all of this is so wild when you actually read the original. And I want you to continue, but I'll also say, I think it also has to do with the nature of sociology and science and the empirical method. Everyone talk about that, but these things, it appears as if this is the conclusion, and so you treat that any belief formed from that with the same degree of credence warranted from the conclusion in the study. Like, but people don't do that. And they're like, this is absolute truth. And do you know most people are X, Y, and Z? And you're like, well, that doesn't fit with how. But we just don't have that like nuance to say, match it to the amount of evidence that is supporting it.
I mean, the other thing that I'm always, I want to sort of slightly rescue the epistemology of the anecdote, because the only, like, the downfall of the anecdote is that it's ungeneralizable, right? You can't say this applies to everyone, or even this applies to most people, or even this applies to some groups of people. But that doesn't mean that anecdotes are useless. It just means that anecdotes are ungeneralizable. You know, like if I use this example a lot with the notion of like a psychological novel. A psychological novel is not a 10,000 person psychological study that will allow you to show something really demonstrative about human nature. But chances are, if it's a psychological novel that's been very well received for over 200 years, there might be something relevant in it to the people that you know, or you know, just because it doesn't reveal some kind of generalizable truth about all people doesn't mean that it doesn't reveal a specific truth that might be relevant to you or people you know similar to those characters. And the advantage of a psychological novel or an anecdote, or like even, you know, existential philosophy that is a highly detailed way to, I don't know, quote unquote, fulfill one type of person's life. That's very handy if you're like that person, because you have a lot more detail precisely because it's not trying to be generalizable. That's like, you know, the especially when you're dealing with like such a set of objects, I suppose, with as much variance in properties as human beings, you're going to necessarily, if you try to create generalizable conclusions about that, you're going to end up abstracting away from a lot of that detail, because you are trying to find properties that apply to all of them. You know, and as a result, you know, it's very difficult. You know, it's very difficult to be able to navigate the world of human beings on purely generalizable conclusions because people are different. You know, I think we sometimes forget this.
I've heard authors talk about this a lot, where they'll say like, the more I generalize, the less my audience actually resonates with it. The more I'm actually just thinking of my own experiences and putting those into my book. The paradox is that they're received way more widely, and people are like, it sounds like you were writing me. And it's like, no, I was writing me, and it just so happens that it connected with you. And I actually think that about the aphorisms, the aphoristic philosophers. You read, I always say Sioran, but how do you say his name?
I say Charan, but I don't know if that's the right pronunciation. I heard someone say it at some point. Well, and it just stuck.
Like you'll read 10 of those, and maybe 2 stick out to you, and you're like, profound, holy cow, my goodness. But you just kind of forgot about the others. And if you read them all, you know, that may hit someone else differently. But it's the same kind of thing where they're pulling from their experience and making a generalizable truth from that. But if it doesn't hit you, it just kind of bounces off, and you hit the next one. You're like, wow, that's so deep. And so I think exactly what you're saying, going in to the personal experience is how it resonates with more people, which is a weird thing to think about.
Yeah, I think that it's, yeah, and I think that's kind of underrated. I talk about the variability just in humans, because I find that a lot of the way that we talk about like sets of people in popular discourse is really attempts to avoid the level of incredible variability amongst humans. Like I know I kind of think particularly here about like online dating discourse. I wrote a video about the concept of love like almost 2 years, a year ago now, and one of the things that, you know, and as part of this, I was like, okay, what problems do people really have with dating? Like, what do people complain about? And I would quite often find that people were very blasé about saying like, oh, you know, like women are like this, or like men are like this. And I just remember thinking, like, hang on a sec, like I've met like a fair amount of men, and I've met a fair amount of women, and like none of them are alike to one another. You know, these are all these. I just feel like I'm just reiterating the very trite truth that people are more different than they are the same, like psychologically speaking. But that seems to be often lost. I think partly because, you know, a lot of the time in these, I'm not suggesting that this is like a widespread thing. This is like largely stuff that was sent to me on TikTok, and like I was looking at like people making dating videos on YouTube. So I'm not suggesting this is like some kind of epidemic or anything. But like, so I did sort of realize that a lot of the time, I think that people were framing certain statements as profound truths about, in this case, entire genders, but not acknowledging that what they were in practice doing was coming up with a pragmatic model of something that is in no way that is revisable and is probably applicable to a few situations and probably not applicable to a whole bunch of situations. And like, there's nothing wrong with that, but of course, that's a much more modest way of talking about things. Whereas if you have your headline as, all women are like this or all men are like this, a lot more people are going to click on that because, if you say something like, here's a pragmatic model for how you might want to approach some people in certain situations. It's just a much harder sell. Nobody's going to click on that.
I love what you're saying. So again, dude, we're coming from opposite directions, which is so funny. I used to think no one understands me, and not in a way that like I'm cool, but just like, dude, this sucks. And when memes first came out, like they started getting shared around. When memes started getting shared around, I almost started crying. When I remember I was in maybe a junior in college, and people started sharing like Velociraptor memes, and I got a tattoo of Velociraptor. I don't even know if you're old enough to remember Velociraptor.
No, I remember with the
that's right,
kind of stroking his chin.
And those just like I was just like, there's other people like me who have the same thoughts. Oh my goodness, I can't believe anyone else thinks the same way as me. And it wasn't necessarily it wasn't what you're talking about, where it's like, here's a generalization, all men are this. It's just like, here's one thought that I had, and it's the anecdote, and it just would resonate so hard with me. And I'm like, dude, this is awesome. There are people that think like me. So it's like the anecdote, when you're just referring to yourself, hits so deep, and the generalizable, the generalizations are the ones where, especially if you're a philosopher, you're going to say, let me find a counterpoint to that. All I need is one person. You said all, so here's one that's not, so you're wrong.
Yeah, it's just a much higher bar to leap over to create a kind of universal claim.
Joe, I wanted to ask you about philosophy of religion stuff. Are you cool talking to that?
Yeah, absolutely.
So you're an atheist yourself. How what do you think about the subfield of philosophy of religion? I'm just so curious to get your take on it, because that's like the world I live. I have to come up out of that world into the general philosophical world, where I think you're probably the opposite.
Yeah, I mean, I find the philosophy of religion very interesting when I read it. I suppose that I find arguments for and against the existence of God very interesting. I find some of the literature on skeptical theism very interesting, for example. And the idea of what you give up the less you know about God and things. And I find that I find it very interesting to read. There are obviously questions to do with intra-religious questions, I suppose, that just aren't interesting to me because I don't believe in the presuppositions that you would need to in order for them to be true. I do think there are some philosophers of religion and just theologians more generally who go tragically undernoticed in the public eye, despite the fact that within philosophy of religion they're like absolute giants, or within theology they're absolute giants. Like the prime example of this is someone like, newly minted Doctor of the Church, Saint Cardinal Henry Newman, John Henry Newman, who's like a colossal titan of theology and of philosophy of religion, and yet I very rarely see him mentioned, and I think that kind of thing's a shame.
I think that Graham one of the just because he's such a titan, and he is a really clear thinker, and I'm sure non-philosophy of religion folks know who he is, but they don't know him the way we do, I think.
I think that one of the elements of philosophy of religion, academic philosophy of religion, that I really do like is that it's a bunch of people who really care whether God exists. I think that's very. I really care whether God exists. I'm kind of agnostic stroke atheist, but I think that it's a very important question. It's one that I want to continue looking into. Partly because I hope that God exists, but also because I think it's a profoundly interesting question. And one of the things that I occasionally get frustrated with in some popular discourse around religion, I feel like I mentioned this on like every podcast I've done for the past 3 months, so I'm terribly sorry if everyone's heard me say this before, is that the kind of popular discussions around God, at least kind of in the online spaces that I'm more familiar with, have kind of shifted towards, like what's the impact of Christianity? Like, what do we owe to Christianity? And I think that's like an interesting question. But I also think that let's not lose sight of the idea that God's existence itself is very important. I I worry that in some ways I'm mainly talking about Christianity here, but I do sometimes worry that a lot of our popular discussions around religion that solely focus on kind of sociological impact of Christianity end up kind of almost trivializing Christianity. Like, because if you think that there's like an all-powerful, all-knowing, all-loving God who sent their son stroke themselves down to earth to die and then rose from that, and like this person will come again in glory to judge the quick and the dead, that's such an impactful thing to believe. It's not. I feel like there's a danger in some of our apologetic discourse that drifts more into the sort of, okay, yeah, what's the sociological impact of Christianity, that we lose sight of like, no, actually, I think we might be cheapening Christianity here. Christianity is like is so much more than that. I worry that, that, and I think that kind of classic apologetic arguments still remain very, very important, because they hit upon this question of, A, does God exist? And then once you're down into the apologetic arguments of each particular religion, is this religion true? Because most of the time they contain incredibly life-impacting propositions that go well beyond sociological impact.
That's a really profound point that a lot of us Christians, at least the philosophers, make a lot. So it's really cool that you brought that up, because there's the sociology of it. There's the Tom Holland Dominion. There's like the we've gotten beat up by the new atheists, and so we want to kind of defend Christianity as a social good, and for the philosophers, we're like, who cares if it's a social good or not? Like, that may be some evidence towards the truth or falsity of it, but we actually kind of care if it's true, which, it seems like St. Paul would say you should really care if it's true or not, because if it's not, then we're to be, we're to be just despised most. Like we're dedicating our lives to a lie. One thing that I think has been fascinating, which is in the same kind of realm, but it's a little bit different, is this emerging field of the axiology of theism. Are you familiar with this at all?
Oh,
it's kind of a niche thing in philosophy of religion, but it's like, should we want God to exist or not? And so it is, not dealing with the fact of the matter, but it is a fascinating thing to say, like, well, if he does exist, should we want him to? If he doesn't exist, should we want him to? Should we not want him to? And you're building a case saying like, well, how would that impact our freedom if a cosmic God, the omnicompetent God, existed? What would that entail for our freedom? And should we want that kind of thing, whether or not he does or does not exist? And I think that's another one that's just like utterly fascinating. Yeah,
it is. Yeah, it's very interesting. I find that I think we can. I mean, I've read Tom Holland's Dominion. It's a very interesting book. Like I do think that its apologetic value is probably quite limited. Like, it's because I mean, again, I sometimes worry that we end up, this merely social view of Christianity does just end up trivializing it, because this kind of end point that a lot of people seem to cite, which is this idea that, okay, yeah, even modern secularism has a Christian stem. It's like, yeah, no, that's fine, but if we encompass our definition of Christianity to include secularism and atheism, what does Christianity amount to? Christianity seems to me to be a really substantive view of the universe, and if it's not that, then this seems. Oh, it reminds me of at the beginning of Mere Christianity, when C.S. Lewis is like, we can't just define Christian as like a nice guy. Like, we've got to have something more than that. And I feel a little bit like, say, we can't just have Christianity or being a Christian to mean comes from Europe or a former colony of Europe. Like, this is like. It's got to be more than that, right? Like, I feel like most Christians would say, it's got to be more than that.
We're going to take an offering here. You're preaching. This is great. Joe, do you have a favorite argument for and against God? One that you really like to think about? Maybe it's not the most powerful, but it's just fun, or maybe you think it's the strongest.
I like the argument from contingency. Yeah. I think that's quite a lot of fun. I really like just the scholastic arguments. I think they're really good fun. And I think that they're also just very intellectually stimulating and so often caricatured. That I think that I always enjoy digging into them. My favorite arguments for atheism, I feel like most arguments for atheism are very much downstream of a kind of arguments for methodological naturalism. So I suppose it would be like I always think that Graham Oppy, I think, makes the best case for agnosticism stroke atheism. And that's, he basically just, it's a case for methodological naturalism. And then at the end, he's like, and God's not there.
No
so
room.
Great. Like, it's because I feel like that's kind of all, that's all an argument for atheism is probably going to end up being. It's going to be like an argument for the non-necessity of God. And you know, I know the other argument that I like is the argument from reason. Just because I think it's a lot of fun. And I think that like,
dude, this is amazing to hear. I can't believe you just said that. I love, yeah, that's great. Okay. Sorry. Keep going.
Like, I don't quite think, I think that there are good responses to the argument from reason, but I occasionally, when I revisit it, I'm like, I'm kind of teasing out all of these naturalistic responses to it. And then I'm like, oh yeah, but in my naturalistic response to it, I've used the notion of a proposition. And like, is that seems a bit, it seems a bit fishy. And then I'm kind of tracing it back and going like, I don't know, like sometimes I get to the end and I'm like, yeah, okay, no, but like you would expect evolution to track truth if we define truth as like the convergence of phenomena. But then like, is that all we've got? Is that, how skeptical is that picture of the world? I mean, that's, you know, is this okay? Am I okay with that? Like, is this, you know, you know, is this even as, you know, am I, you know, even am I satisfied with a kind of Kantian synthetic a priori picture, which is like, for me, the most obvious response is to say something like, hey, like we think in propositions and logic because I don't know what it would mean to be able to make sense of the world were it not for those pre-existing conditions that are just baked in, you know. I'm not necessarily into a transcendental spirit a la Kant, but like into the human lens on the world. But then again, you know, it's, I sometimes think, yeah, but how far have I justified reason there? Because I've got a very kind of convergent phenomenal reason, and you know, I've still got a bit of the pragmatist dog left inside me. So like, maybe that's enough. That's all I was meant to care about. But then, like, you know, I'm effectively saying I don't care what's real. And that feels like a very strange thing to say in a theological argument. So then, I don't know, it's something that I come back to, and intermittently it turns me toward, it's the thing that got me started on the idea of non-materialist atheism and just constructing like arguments for non-materialist atheism. So just because I think that, yeah, I think that arguments like the argument from reason and more generally the idea of like, okay, how do we fit all of this seemingly wooey correspondence stuff into our naturalistic world, is genuinely non-trivial problems. And what I tend to end up giving at the point where I'm dissatisfied with any of my sometimes I'm just satisfied with one of my naturalistic responses, but sometimes I'm not, and I will end up often saying giving something like the Quine-Putnam indispensability argument in maths, which is to say, you know, if we can't do without these objects, we'll have to concede they exist because they're indispensable to our baseline ontology of the world. If you can't get around them, you have to accept them. But nonetheless, you know, things don't quite follow from there. Like that's what we can do. But then again, you know, that comes across that comes against the issue that we were talking about earlier in the conversation, which is that then you have this slightly fishy looking non-naturalist shaped branch coming off of your naturalist ontology stroke epistemology, and that's not necessarily that satisfying. So I'm not 100% sure. I think that although I do think, however, that a lot of this is due to the fact that on your ontology, whether you're a naturalist or a non-naturalist or a theist or an atheist or what have you, your ontology and your epistemology are interdependent in a way that makes it very hard to start with one and end up with the other. You know, like if you know, it's like it's like the Cartesian circle, right? Like even that, you know, that's a kind of theist version of that, where you say, okay, you know, I get to God through my epistemology, and then the ontology of God supports my epistemology. But then, like that is a circle. I would suggest that both that and, to a certain extent, the argument from reason are outgrowths of this wider phenomenon, which is that what you think is possible to know and how you think it's possible to know it is going to depend on what you think exists. And what you think exists must depend on how you think you come to know things and what you think it's possible to know. And so I suppose I don't know where I've ended up, apart from the idea that I'm pretty sure that foundationalism in epistemology is really hard to defend. And might, if you wanted to get some kind of foundationalism in epistemology, I think you might have to be satisfied with a kind of pragmatically advanced hinge proposition that you're just like, I can't get away from this, as opposed to what you kind of want, which is a hard bedrock that you can point to. But having said that, arguably this kind of bottoming out at just a thing that you cannot in practice deny has a rich history in philosophy. It is in effect Aristotle's argument for the law of non-contradiction, is that he just says, try getting rid of it. To which, of course, Graham Priest says, let me try. But most people say, I don't know, I can't think without the law of non-contradiction. So that's kind of... So my point is more that non-foundationalism in epistemology, I think, and this may be just really controversial, is a lot older than people think.
Dude, I can't believe you said all this. I always go back to Aristotle's defense, indirect proof, whatever, of the law of non-contradiction as a kind of transcendental argument to say, like, hey, look, it's indirect. You can't directly use it without begging the question. But if we have to use it, it is kind of a pragmatic. I mean, the transcendental argument proponents, a lot of them turn out to be pragmatists for reasons like this. But I see the same thing with C.S. Lewis in Miracles, or with Arthur Balfour and his argument from reason. And I'm so glad to see you connect it with Descartes' cogito, or even Augustine, si fal or sum. These are things, it's like, look, if I can't deny it, then if the rest of my system depends on it, then it seems reasonable for me to hold it. But to point out that, hey, that may be a pragmatic notion. That may not be this like firm bedrock that you're claiming it is. Just if it's pragmatism, it's pragmatism. All right, like, just own it. I love to see the whole connection, man. That's really cool. Yeah.
It's I think that I think pragmatism is a really interesting philosophical approach, and I think that it's also just doesn't get much of a look in the public eye, and I think that's a shame, because I whenever I'm trying to hook people on, you should go read Hugh Price or just any of these more approachable pragmatist philosophers, I would tend to say something like, I tend to try and do a kind of a quick pedagogical demonstration, which is to ask them to give a proposition and then say why, until they get to a point, and almost always they will get to a point where they either say just because, in which case I'll say, give a different answer. That's not like, that's circular. But most of the time they'll just end up saying, well, I just can't deny that. I just have to believe that. How do you expect me to not believe that? And I think, great, that's a pragmatic argument. Go explore the wonderful world of pragmatism in philosophy and anti-foundationalism in epistemology. It's great fun.
That's so good. Joe, can I follow up on the argument from reason? Can I pump your intuition?
Yeah, absolutely.
So this is one that I have a hard time understanding naturalists, maybe reductive naturalists or whatever, being like affirming naturalism on naturalism. I don't want to claim it's self-defeating, but I can't help but think, like, you think the naturalist who thinks that our minds are reducible to our brains, and the brain, fizzing's going on in the brain, whatever, it's kind of a mean way to say it, but it's hard for me to understand how that view can be affirmed on that view, because it seems to me like, well, that's just, even if it's not a deterministic causal chain, there's still non-rational causes for that belief, which seems to me like, okay, you can maybe say that's the genetic fallacy or something, but it still seems like our reasons ought to be grounded in more reason, and not in non-rational causes. So can you help me out with that? Like, I just have a hard time. Maybe I need to explain it more.
I think that for me, I suppose the strongest way to get around that particular worry would be to say something like, and this I find very interesting, because it's almost like a sort of a modern version of the difference between hierarchical and linear causation, is to say something like, the irrational, the brain states are irrational causes, but the thing that makes a belief state rational isn't the causal chain that's led up to it. It's the justificatory chain. And the justificatory chain isn't a matter of linear causality. It's a matter of hierarchical causality, to which my tentative reply is always like, okay, how naturalistic is this hierarchical causality? Because, of course, Anscombe's response to the argument from reason is like along those lines. It's to say, yeah, but, whether a proposition can feature in a rational argument isn't a matter of the material causal chain that's led up to it. It's a matter of whether it is set inside a certain formal structure, and that formal structure being truth-preserving. And of course, Anscombe is a Catholic, so somebody could say, "What's your naturalistic interpretation of that formal structure?" And Anscombe can say, "I'm not a naturalist. Like, what are you doing in my house?" But but if you are a naturalist, then you then have to say something like, "Okay, something is justified through having some kind of formal mapping onto a valid logical structure." What is that valid logical structure? And then I suppose, if you're I think it's like, I don't remember, it's early or mid-career Putnam who ends up being a kind of empiricist about logic for a bit. But if you take that view, you can say something like, logical laws are abstracted from empirical truths, yada, yada, yada. And then you could probably end up saying something like, look, if you're asking me whether I can believe my own perceptions, I'm just going to have to tell you that that's the ground level of my epistemic system, and like we're at bedrock. So that would be my kind of, I know that would be, I personally sort of lean towards this this ever so slightly more Kantian picture, whereby the laws of logic are just how we interpret facts, in the same way that, or like how we normatively interpret facts, I suppose, in the same way that like the color spectrum is how I interpret light waves. And it's not that like, but then again, when that fails me, I tend to lean back on something like the indispensability argument, and to say, I genuinely don't know if I can come up with a good justification for the laws of logic, because I don't know how I would do so without appealing to the laws of logic. At which point, maybe I am just saying, that's bedrock. I can't do without the laws of logic. Whatever ontology you want to give them, I have to concede to their truth. And if that commits me to a non-materialist kind of metaphysics, then I think that I'll just have to accept that, because like, if there's no other way of grounding it, what am I going to do? I can't not have them. I'd just be. What's that bit at the opening of the second Meditations, where Descartes got to the end of the skeptical method, and he's just like, oh god, man, like I'm so confused. I can't rely on anything. I'm in darkness. It's horrible. And I guess I'd just be there.
That's so good. So I think there's might be a connection to like Gettier problems here, where it's like or maybe the no false lemma response, where it's like, okay, so maybe this physical process is truth tracking. It'd be hard to know if we take it super seriously, because it's like, well, how do I know if it's truth tracking, or if it's tracking beliefs that make me think it's truth tracking but help me survive? And it's like, we're going really deep here now, but it's like if I had a brain lesion and it produced a bunch of beliefs and they all seem to be true, to me it seems like, I don't know, would you call that, if a brain lesion were like more than 50% truth tracking, that it produced beliefs that were more than 50% truth tracking, would you say that's like a good source of beliefs? It might be. That's kind of weird, right?
I suppose
I want to say no, but maybe.
I'd have to do some thinking about it. For me, I suppose it would. For me, I think it would be more about the justificatory structures between the beliefs than it would be about the beliefs themselves. Because, like, I think that you can have a very reliable process that starts off with just 3 false beliefs and is then like the perfect logical processor from there, and it's very reliable, but like it just it's just not given much to work with.
But seeing the belief structure,
I don't know.
To me, that's up top. That's like in the realm of what I would say the more like immaterial type stuff, whereas like it's all emerges out of, or its supervenient base is just physical things that don't seem to really have much to do with that.
And I think that clarifying exactly how those emerge would be very interesting. And I think it's broadly kind of an open problem. I think that the only thing that does give me pause for thought, so you can appeal to facts that seem like they prima facie support the kind of naturalistic interpretation of reason, even if the naturalistic interpretation of reason is underspecified. For example, you can point to times where we know we have flaws, like cognitive biases, and you think, okay, well, if we were non-naturalist truth-tracking machines, we would expect not to have those. Or like something like, or like just appealing to the history of logic. So one thing, one like amazing fact, I suppose, about the history of logic is that, you have these two systems, Stoic logic and Aristotelian logic, both emerging in ancient Greece and then only being unified in 1879. And that seems like, okay, if it took that long to unify two logical systems, it seems like logic and generally kind of good justified reasoning is something that we discover over time in this slow, arduous naturalistic process. So I think that you can appeal to the general or observations that would support the idea that the human being as belief former is likely to be the result of a naturalistic process. But then, the question of how you end up with an epistemology that gets in touch with the actual world in like a noumenal sense. If you're not satisfied even with Kant, then I think that is a serious problem. And I think that quite a lot of the time, also I think it's a problem that people can be quite flippant about. I think that one of the reasons why I really like the question of God's existence is because it is one of the few questions that forces you to consider the noumenal in a way that's like that's very relevant to you.
Totally.
So in almost every other case, I can just go, hey man, there's convergent phenomenal experience. Like that does exactly the same job 99.999% of the time. And the times that it doesn't matter because it's structurally similar. So but then you end up with something like the question of God's existence. And you think, God, what am I going to do about that? Because that's a proposition that is not about phenomena. That's a proposition about noumena that nonetheless, if the theist is correct, has a direct bearing on my phenomena. It's not like, it's not that it's not that God remains in the untouchable noumena and never comes into contact with us. There's a bridge there. And then, that's the point at which I think that, at least for a lot of people, I think that this, the mere having an ontology that's merely that consists of convergent phenomena becomes less comfortable.
Dude, this is so fast. I keep saying it, but I really do appreciate the way you think, and I'm with you on the noumena of God, because it would be directly relevant for our phenomena, but also for the categories of understanding that we use to form the phenomena. Like, did he design us a certain way? Is that why? I don't know that Kant ever answered that question. Why do we all have the same categories? And it's like, that could be an implication as well. Or, why is it that it took us so long to unify logics? If God made us to be rational in his image, what's the deal with that? And you go, well, maybe the doctrine of sin or total depravity. There's some theology you can add in, but it's going to have to do some heavy lifting as well. Dude, this is great. This has been so much fun. I wanted to finish up with just a quick couple questions about the state of public philosophy. Is that cool?
Yeah, absolutely.
What do you make of the state? This is a hard question where you just talked about not doing doing anecdotal and generalizing and stuff. If for as much as you've noticed, Philosophy Tube or Philosophy YouTube, what do you think? Like, are we doing well? Is it on the uptick? Or does it have a problem? There's a big video that came out that it's broken. What do you think of Philosophy YouTube?
I think that Philosophy YouTube, I think, suffers from sort of the same inherent problems that any kind of public expounding of difficult, often academic problems has, which is that, like anything, you're trying to appeal to people, especially for something like what I want to do, which I'm very much Like, I want to grab people who aren't necessarily into philosophy or think it's pointless and like show them that it's not. And in order to do that, you know, you need to make it sexy. And like, you know, and I try and find very natural ways of doing that. I try to like, you know, I want to do that without misrepresenting people. And that's tricky. What I find, the way that I kind of reconcile the competing drives of you know, trying to be entertaining and making things relevant and accessible, and also not trying to make things seem as like simpler than they actually are, is just to try and signal when I say I put disclaimers at the start of the video. I try and often say I'm simplifying this, but because I don't want somebody, partly because I feel like the danger with public communication of anything, be it philosophy or physics or biology, is that somebody gets to the end of a popular presentation and thinks that that's all that there is. And I'm just very keen to try and not get that impression, because I feel like that for me is the real danger. Because I think that, I think that it is very easy, especially if somebody seems to know what they're talking about, or that kind of, for you to get to the end of that and think, right, okay, yeah, that person, that's the interpretation of Nietzsche, or that's exactly what I don't know, that's exactly what Marx meant by this, or I have a perfect understanding of Gödel's incompleteness theorem now. And it's like, no, all of these things are so complicated, and people spend their entire lives studying them. And so I think that, and I don't think that problem can be solved by making every YouTube video a comprehensive analysis of its topic, because, partly because, you'll find the same disclaimers, obviously, in much more detail, and they have a much greater claim to authority than I do. But you'll find the same kinds of disclaimers at the beginning of papers, and you'll find the same kinds of disclaimers at the beginning of books. Like when I open my copy of David Owen's commentary on Nietzsche's Genealogy of Morals, or Paul Katsafanis's project on Nietzsche's psychology, the first chapter is about things, at least partly about things they won't deal with, and sort of putting themselves in context with other authors. And I think that, if even in hundreds of pages of philosophy books, these topics are so complex that they cannot be given a treatment that does not warrant a disclaimer, then YouTube videos, I think, clearly do warrant disclaimers, and that's why I have one in almost every one. I'd have higher attention if I didn't, but it's how I make my, it's how I get to sleep at night. So that's, I don't know. I know that I don't know. I suppose that would be my kind of naive take, I suppose. But then again, I'm kind of not like, I'm not massively on philosophy YouTube. It feels a bit like bringing work home. So I just kind of, I don't have a good sense of like the state of philosophy.
That's
YouTube.
Hilarious.
I know. What do you think?
The last thing you said resonates with me so hard, where I almost feel bad that I don't know as many people. I was just, in the philosophy space. I have 6 or 7 projects. So I'm kind of in the notebook space for ParkNotes. I think I have like 250,000 subscribers over there. So that's kind of my world now. And it's like, people are like, yeah, what's up with notebook YouTube? I'm like, I don't know, man. I'm not trying to live there. This is kind of in the philosophy of religion YouTube world, where most people are just debating. And I'm like, well, I don't really watch those. I don't, that was young me. I'm too tired to listen to debates anymore. So I feel the same way. When I heard about you not too long ago through Jared Henderson. He was like, Joe's someone who does really good work. And I'm like, okay, let me look at that. Then I had to get past like my jealousy and be like, dang it, he's doing so well. And then I'm like, wait, he's actually really good. So I've kind of collected a few people that I can at least put people onto, because this is a podcast where it's more conversational. And so someone's like, well, what if I want to go deeper? I'm like, well, first, definitely read the books, but here's a video by Joe, or, Jared talks about technology use in a really interesting philosophical way. Here, check out that. So usually that's how I'm using YouTube, Philosophy Tube. I'm just kind of picking and choosing from people that I think are good, who I can share stuff with. But someone just shared. Who was it? It was Stephen West from Philosophize This. He was just on my show. I love that
Oh
guy.
yeah.
But he was like, yeah, there's this big video that said Philosophy Tube is broken, and I looked at it. It's the former Wisecrack guy. Sorry, I never remember his name. But 6 or 7, like the people he named, I was like, I never heard of this person before. I've been on YouTube forever. It's just so funny that it's like, oh, they have millions of subscribers. I've never even seen one of their videos. So I kind of think that making it into a big group, I don't know, everyone kind of has their own audience, man. I don't know that we are a big thing where everyone's watching all of the different philosophy tubers. I'm always surprised to see a new person and learn that they have 5 million subscribers and I've never seen one of their videos. It's amazing.
I was trying to think. I don't know. I suppose if there was one message I would give to anyone who watches my videos, I think I say this a lot in my videos, so you're probably sick of hearing it, but also anyone watches almost anyone's videos on philosophy on YouTube, and I'm 99.9% sure that they would agree with my statement, which is like, don't be satisfied with the videos. Like, go and these are in 99.9% of cases, unless you're literally watching like a lecture series by a professor at a university who's just recorded their lectures and is kind enough to put them on YouTube. These are like often introductions aimed at people without necessarily an enormous amount of background in philosophy. Their point is not to give you the ultimate philosophical truth. Their point is to argue. Well, I mean, whenever I'm writing a video, my main thought, especially if I'm writing like on a particular philosopher, my main thought at the end of it isn't, oh, this person knows everything about this philosopher now. They've got to the end of the video and they're an expert and they're going to go start publishing papers in top journals. My goal at the end of a video is always, the question I ask myself when I finish a script is, do I think I've put this person in a position where they can go and read the philosopher for themselves and are hopefully slightly better informed and have a kind of background picture of what it's all about? And that that's when I film them, whereas, like I've got so many scripts that I just abandoned halfway through because either I didn't think they were very good, or I didn't think I'm doing a very good job, or that I thought I don't know enough about this. I need to go away and do more research. So it's like, it's a balance. Like I think that, but I also think that, looking at YouTube philosophy as a kind of isolated phenomenon, it has the same kind of pressures of understanding and accessibility as publishing and as as like, as science communication. I think that philosophy, whenever I look at whenever I think about philosophy communication on YouTube, I tend to go and look at what I think are some of the greatest science communicators in history. People like Richard Feynman, like absolutely legendary communicator of physics, and think, okay, like what was he trying to do? Because you read 7 Easy Steps is like one of his best-selling physics books. It's still one of the most highly regarded pop physics books of all time. And you read it, that Richard Feynman obviously is simplifying everything down, and he's trying to put you in a position where you can go and look into this for yourself. And I feel like that's what YouTube philosophy, or YouTube anything, is better placed to do. I don't think that we're not going to be. We're YouTube is not, nor should it replace academia or academic study. There's not, the medium isn't suited for that, and also like it's just not the right place for it. But I think that it's when I get asked quite a lot, do I consider myself a philosopher? And I don't. I consider myself like a philosophy teacher, like a la, once I'm done with this YouTube stuff, I plan to go and work in a secondary school. Like that's what I that's the approach that I have. I'm not like, I think that one of the potential difficulties with YouTube, and like, any kind of public communication thing where you're teaching someone about something that at a very base level, you're probably going to know more about it than the person who's watching it. Because otherwise, like, Brian Leiter's not clicking on a video I've made about Nietzsche. Like, he's got better things to do, if Graham Priest is not going to click on my video about logical fallacies. Like they're not. They're just not. And if they were, they'd be terribly disappointed. And So I think that, but I think that what hopefully YouTube videos do is just give people a
Yeah.
taste of what's out there. But I think that the danger is that implicitly, I think when you're looking at someone on a screen talking at you about something that you don't necessarily know as much about, there is a kind of implicit assumption that I think some people make that like the person on your screen knows everything. And I think that one of the reasons why I put disclaimers on almost every, on every one of my videos, apart from the ones where I'm just reacting to memes, is that I think that something that public-facing or philosophy communicators can do actively is try and push against that, the kind of implicit, unasked for assumption of authority that somebody can have a tendency to have when they click on a video.
I think that's great. I think that's all right there. I have started finally calling myself a philosopher. I had enough guests who I really respected call me that. So I'm like, all right, I can just appeal to authority. But then I try to keep one foot in academics because I don't want to let go of what I tried to like claw my way up to. So like I'll still publish or seek to get papers published, and I still present at conferences. And I'm like, I think that's probably enough. But if we're going with like the old school
Absolutely.
view of philosophy, it's like no one can actually call them. It's an honorific, so you don't get to call yourself that. So it'd be like calling yourself a sage, which is just like super cringy and embarrassing. So I totally get why some people get upset by that. But I think you're right about like the benefit of YouTube is it's a first step. Here now, go read these books, go watch some more philosophy, go argue with your friends, go maybe join a book club or go. It's not all about arguing in the comments, but be a good person and argue in the comments. But I love that as like a first step to go and find some other things. I think maybe the only kinds of videos on YouTube where it is the last stop would be like maybe Joe Schmid's Majesty of Reason. If you've heard of that, Joe will like go over his academic papers and read them to you. And it's like, well, you don't need to go anywhere else. That's the whole argument. Now just argue with him there. But like, even if a professor uploads their lectures, they require their students to go and read more books also. So it's like, it's always going to include more, except for Joe, because he's completist for sure. Yeah.
I think, but again, it's like, I think that maybe a part of this shift could be just a wider shift in the way that we view learning, which is not as something that is ever done.
I think that's right.
I always think my fondest hope is for me in 5 years to think that me now is an idiot, and as long as I can keep that up every 5-year intervals, I assume that I'm kind of relatively on the right track.
That's awesome, man. Well, I look forward to 5 years from now when you're a priest in the Christian church and looking back.
I got this big Orthodox beard.
Right. That'll be fantastic. I'll be the atheist on the other side, and we'll trade places. Joe, thanks so much for coming on, man. This is a really great conversation. I've just been showering you with praise, but I can't help it. Like I genuinely like the way that you think. It's really cool. I love seeing the connections that I've also made. So seeing it in someone else is really cool to see. And then, dude, you're just a great communicator. So if you haven't heard of Unsolicited Advice, you probably have, but if you haven't, go check it out. I'll leave the link in the description. Definitely go and watch a bunch of his stuff. Joe, thanks so much for coming on the podcast.
Oh, thank you. Thank you for having me.
Anything you'd like to plug before? I mean, I gave you a little one, but I don't know anything else you would like to.
I really don't have anything to plug.
No book deal yet.
No, I mean I'm writing a pitch for something at the moment, but I probably can't say anything about it publicly.
We're all doing it. I love it. I'm actually at first I was kind of embarrassed. I'm like, oh yeah, I guess I'm writing a book too. But then it's like, actually, all the people I know who are writing them, I'm gonna buy them. They're gonna be exciting, really cool books. So it's gonna be cool. Yeah.
Well, I can tell you my pitch topic, but it can't go out on the video because it'll give the game away.
Don't say it yet. Folks, we're going to leave you here, and then I'm going to go get some background knowledge. It's going to be awesome. So, all right, that's going to have to do it for now. This has been Parker's Pensées, and as always, all glory to God.